What we're going to talk about today is basically the evolution of telecommunications threats. It's not a technical talk. We don't have time for that. It's kind of a historical review of where we came from and where we're going with telecommunication security. So, we basically have an agenda that goes through all the generations of telecoms, and I'll just go through that briefly. So where did we start? We actually started in China, 1800 before Christ. So this is a long time ago, and the Chinese, they were already at war. They already had a lot of conflicts and need to communicate about those conflicts and to their generals remotely, and they were using smoke signals to do that. So it's quite interesting to see that the first telecommunication technology started in China, because basically that's where it ends as well. And nowadays, the major telecommunication vendors are Chinese. What was interesting about the smoke signals is that they suffer from the same threats to their security model as modern communication technology, as we're going to review. And after that, we had, in Greece, still before the Christian era, some evolution of the smoke signals. They use a more sophisticated way with fire, and same principle. They would use visual indicators to communicate their messages. When we evolved from that, we of course hit the telegram, which was invented in 1844. You know what it is, I'm not going to remind you, and followed closely by the telephone. And all those technologies share the same threat model, which we're going to discuss. Other historical milestones in the telecommunications are the semaphore, another form of signal to communicate messages, the telegraph, wireless telegraphy by Tesla, who's an amazing inventor, as you know, and invented that in 1893. The first radio by Marconi, which is really a huge breakthrough in telecommunications. Fiber optics were invented in the 1920s, even though most of us didn't get to enjoy it until almost a century later. The first cellular telephone was actually used by the Swedish police in 1946. Now, Scandinavia has always been at the forefront of telecommunications development. They also created the first mobile networks, etc. The first communication satellites were put into orbit in the 60s, and the real first mobile phone was the 1973 Motorola. We'll have a picture of that later. And the first cellular network was in Japan in 1979. What's interesting about Nikola Tesla, the guy I mentioned earlier, is that he was quite a visionary, and if you read what he was writing in 1926, was talking about a device where we could hear one another as perfectly as though we were face to face, despite intervening distance of thousands of miles, and this would fit in our pocket. I mean, this one in 1926. I mean, could you predict communication technology in year 2100? I doubt it, but this guy, he was a visionary. So let's go to the first generation of mobile telephony, and we'll also briefly talk about the fixed line telephony, because it's also part of telecommunications. Now you've got a nice picture of the phone that was called the Brick, which is the very first generation, and the basic security problems, as I told you, were the same as the early generation of communication technology, including smoke signals. Is we have a lack of authentication. You don't really know who sent you that message. I mean, someone else could be putting up a fire and making smoke signals, right? It's very difficult to protect against interception, because your smoke signals or your semaphore or whatever, they can be seen by somebody else, so they can be intercepted. And messages could be replayed. You know, there's no integrity in the message. So all those technologies were suffering from that, including the fixed line telephony, but with a subtle difference. The fixed line telephony is what we call the walled garden model, which means all the infrastructure is privately, at the time, state-owned, and it wasn't reachable by the public. The only way you could interfere with the telecommunication network was to do what's called blue boxing in the early days of in-band signaling. You can see a blue box on that picture. A blue box was a device that would send some frequencies that would mimic the frequencies used by the operators to control their network. Now, they were able to do that because the signaling was in-band. In-band, which means the same channel as the speech. So, because it was on the same channel, you had access to it. Telecoms are always controlled by signaling from the first moment they existed. And the blue boxing was a lot of fun. I mean, there are some very famous figures, including, for example, Steve Jobs, who played with the blue box. It was a very fun device. You could basically tell the switch to, well, first you would dial a toll-free number, so you wouldn't have any charge on your phone bill. And then you would tell the switch, well, just clear that call. And then you would send the dialing sequence for another number. And then you would be connected to that other number. But the billing system would still believe you would be calling that toll-free number. So because of that, you were able to do not only free calls, but also calls that could not be traced. Because if they were traced, they wouldn't have the proper billing record, so they wouldn't be able to find where the call originated from. There were other forms of boxing, including red boxing, beige boxing, etc. They all involved mimicking tones that the networks use for signaling. And other issues with fixed networks were subscription fraud. This is a classic. You can do it in everywhere. You register a line with a fake identity, you run up charges, and then you disconnect. Or you would connect to your neighbor's line, etc. And PABX, which is still happening today. I believe there was a talk about it at HITB this year here. PABX are basically a mini switchboard used by companies. They can be abused, and then you can do free calls, etc. But this was mostly for the old days. So one very important landmark that involved fixed network, which I have to mention because for many hackers of the older generation, this was a starting point for them. It's a movie War Games. And in the movie War Games was the first time the public was introduced to what is known now as war dialing. Actually, war dialing comes from the movie name, which is basically dialing number after number with a modem and waiting for it to answer. And when it answered, you would try login name, password, you would try all sorts of things, and you would discover a lot of things. Now, this was very popular in the 80s, obviously after the movie was released in 1984. And in the 90s, nowadays, there are not so many systems connected to modems, but there still are some. So I suppose some people are still war dialing, but there wouldn't be much because now there is the internet and other technologies to connect systems. So the fixed network was pretty secure, I mean, apart from those little cases I described, because it was closed. And we will see later that this is also the model that the mobile technology used. And it worked for a while, and eventually it sort of caught up with them. So let's review those mobile technologies. So first, really what we call 1G, which is the analog technology. It was started in Scandinavia, in the Nordic countries, NMT, Nordic Mobile Telephony. And in the US, they developed a similar version called AMPS, which was analog. And the problem with analog is that, well, first you can intercept the calls. All you needed was a frequency scanner, pictured here, and you would intercept communications because they were not encrypted. That was quickly a big problem. The other issue with analog systems is that they were not properly authenticated. The only thing that would authenticate was a serial number that you would have on the phone. As you can imagine, a serial number is not a really strong security measure, especially that you could just find out easily about it. And once you had it, you would be able to clone the phone, well, just reuse that serial number, and you would make free calls based on someone else's accounts. So that was a problem. And the lack of encryption basically made everything impossible to secure. Other limitations of analog phones was they were, of course, using at the time basic and proprietary firmware, which was by no means secure. They had no data capabilities whatsoever, which in a way was good for them because no data means no hackers would use it for making hacking. The baseband and the main CPU were not segregated, which is the case in modern phones now. So the part that controls the radio and the part that controls the phone were on the same processor. There was no secure enclave to store cryptographic keys because there were no cryptographic keys. There was absolutely no integrity mechanism. You couldn't run any custom software. There would be no roaming. So they were not really a target for hackers. I mean, hackers were busy at the time with fixed line, with the internet that got started, and with X25, etc. So to counter those problems with first generation of mobile phones, GSM got started, right? It started as a European consortium with major telecom vendors and manufacturers, and it was called Groupe Spécial Mobile, which is a French term, and eventually, because it became international, they renamed it to GSM, Global System for Mobile Telecommunication. And it was a serious and successful attempt at building a secure network. First, they dealt with interception by encrypting over the air with protocols called A5 and A3. And they had, unfortunately, a semi-proprietary algorithm. When I say semi-proprietary, it means they were not disclosed to the public, but the operators had access to them because the operators said, hey, wait, we don't want to trust you. We need to know what you're doing. Show us the algorithm. Now, anyone who's been dealing with cryptography knows that it's a bad idea to have private algorithm. The only secure crypto algorithm is the one that has been reviewed by peers. That wasn't the case, and we'll see what the problem it led to. The authentication was really a breakthrough. They separated the identity from the phone itself. So the SIM card you carry in your pocket, in your phone, it's actually a secure device that stores your cryptographic keys, and you cannot extract those cryptographic keys. I mean, the secret key cannot be extracted from a SIM. All you can tell the SIM is do those computations, calculate that challenge response, calculate that cipher, etc. So because of that, you couldn't steal the secret key needed for decryption or for faking authentication. So this made it very, very secure. Some other interesting development of that technology was caller ID, which at the time was a breakthrough in mobile communications. You could see who was calling you. And on the infrastructure side, very serious developments, advent of SS7, which is what we call out-of-band signaling. You remember what I said about in-band? You could control a telecommunication network by, replaying the tones it was using to control it. But with SS7, the signaling system number 7, this is not possible anymore. All the control is outside of the channels you have access to, so you cannot reach the SS7 network, and therefore you cannot abuse it. And of course, this very successful technology had a huge growth in worldwide deployment, and that's what we are all using today. There were other competing technologies in late 90s, early 2000s, but basically GSM and its evolutions remained. So for a while, there were absolutely no security issues. No one knew how to break the GSM model. I would say up to 1998, there was absolutely no security weaknesses, no reported vulnerabilities, no abuse, nothing. Only some academic research into radio protocols that could denial of service attacks, sort of stuff like that. However, in 1999 and 1998, some of the crypto algorithm leaked. Someone at an operator decided that it would be a good idea for the public to review that. So eventually, people got their hands into the COMP128, which is the hash algorithm, and to A51 and A52, which are the encryption algorithm. And there were some interesting results. The first security paper on GSM security was published in Asia in 2001 at Black Hat, Hong Kong and Singapore, by myself, actually. So this sort of raised the interest of people to study more in this field. At the time, the security model of the SIM card was still not broken. The infrastructure was still not compromised, and the signaling was completely out of band. That was the death of phreaking, which was, phreaking is the term used to to characterize the hackers that were abusing the early phone systems. So because of this cryptanalysis research, the security model became under threat. Now, when people knew that there were vulnerabilities in the algorithms, they started thinking, what can we do with this? How can we abuse that discovery for doing nasty stuff? So let's see what they started doing. First, SIM cloning was made available by a guy called Briceno through the algorithm that was leaked. So because of that, you would be able to clone SIM cards, make free calls, etc. Then more research by the same guy on the A5 algorithm, which at the time was able to break the cryptography, but it wasn't really practical yet. The security model was broken. He could show how to do to decrypt the traffic, but it was really computationally intensive, so it wasn't practical yet. That there were more cryptanalysis by Buryukov and Shamir. You know, Shamir is a S in RSA, and Weissman in 1999. And then the hackers started to get interested in that. So at the CCC event, you know, the Chaos Computer Club, which is the oldest hacking group in Europe, they do an event every winter, which it's very technical. It's a very good event. And two guys, Carsten Knoll and Tobias Engel, started publishing how to abuse those vulnerabilities in a more practical way. And of course, this meant this was the open door to abuse. On top of that, people working inside the mobile operators, they started to say, hey, wait, we have access to those systems. What can we do? And they started to abuse it. You had a lot of insider fraud cases that were being developed. And because of those vulnerabilities and the publication at the CCC, etc., people started developing what we call IMSI catchers. Now, IMSI catchers abuse those vulnerabilities to allow interception, man-in-the-middle attacks, and IMSI tracking. IMSI is the internal number that is associated to your phone identity, well, to your account, really. And law enforcement agencies, they started using that because even though there is a lawful interception system in every mobile network, the problem is that you need usually a court order or some sort of warrant to be able to use it. So the police and the intelligence agencies, they say, wait, if we use an IMSI catcher, we don't need to ask permission from anyone. So, of course, this became very popular. And the next thing that got very interesting for hackers is that at the beginning the GSM wasn't really doing data very well. I mean, just showing you the early GSM networks, they had V32 bis modem. I mean, you have to be very old to remember what that is. They were able supporting fax and dial-up connection and X25 networks, but at the speed of 9600, there's no way you would actually use that for anything serious. And there was a really disconnect at the time between the telecommunication operators and the internet guys. I mean, at the time in this early 2000, I was working with telcos and most of them didn't even know the internet existed. But just going back to that drawing, you can see that there's a whole lower part is basically the evolution of the GSM network to speak TCP/IP and to interconnect mobile phones to the internet. And because of those elements, then you could use your mobile phone to make internet connection. And that really changed a lot of things. On the handset side, still I'm looking from a hacker perspective, how interesting is it? But the first handset, they had proprietary operating system, they had low bandwidth, high latency, they had very small screens, black and white. They were not really, you couldn't really use them to do anything. And there were many attempts, early attempts to do things practical, like WAP, which hopefully you don't remember. And still, people say, okay, I'd better hack from my computer. And this started to change when we moved to the third generation. Now, the third generation, the data speeds, they became finally usable and practical. I mean, On a 3G connection, you can do some work, you can browse graphical websites. The terminals, they started to have larger screens, better resolution, they would have more CPU resources, you could run custom software. So suddenly it became interesting as a hacking platform. And on top of that, the IP stack, which at the beginning didn't exist in mobile operators, they all had their proprietary protocols. Even they were still using X25 very late. But finally, everybody started to move to IP. Now, not only the IP connectivity for mobile data, but also the infrastructure connectivity. The management networks were on TCP/IP, and then the signaling network, the SS7, was being transported over IP through a protocol called SIGTRAN, which is just a layer that replaces the first stack protocols. So everything is transported over IP, and guess what? Hackers love TCP/IP. That's what they used to. They couldn't really hack mobile networks because they didn't understand those proprietary, obscure, undocumented protocols that didn't have access to. But as soon as IP was there, they were able to go and play. And this is at that time that we started to see some very serious attacks on the network infrastructures, the operators themselves. The most bizarre and fascinating story of all happened in Greece in 2005. And this is just a reminder of how a normal interception system works. You've got the cell towers. You can see the guy talking here. The cell towers relay the signal to the switch, which then, redirects the call to the other guys, etc. And inside that switch, you've got some modules that allows lawful interception. Now, this is the standard way to do things. And remember, to do lawful interception, well, first you have to be authorized, obviously. Only the law enforcement and intel agencies can do that. And obviously only the one of the country you're operating in, but also you need court orders, warrants, etc. In Greece, what happened, and it is believed this is a nation state because of the sophistication of the attack, but the attacker was never clearly identified. Basically, what those guys did, they broke into the operator network. Maybe they had some complicity inside. It's not 100% known because the guy who could have answered that question was killed. And they modified the switch itself. Now, it might sound like something easy, modify a switch, but when you know how a switch operates, it's extremely complicated. A switch is massive. I mean, a medium network size switch would almost fill a quarter of this room because it's, dozens of racks and proprietary hardware and proprietary software running all the time with, real-time operating system. It's programmed in a language called Plex, which probably most of you haven't even heard of. So for someone to go and modify a live switch in that bizarre language, that was really amazing. And then they really compromised everything else around the network. They allowed it to basically exfil data and to do silent interception that no one knew about, not the operator, not the government, nothing. So just to show that the sophistication of attacks has increased, and of course, because of the way we use phones in our lives, well, the governments are interested in that, and hostile governments, So we don't know who did that thing in Greece, but there's only a few players that have the resources to do that. I'll let you guess who. Anyway, moving on to 4G, which is basically the technology that most of us are using today. The architecture has evolved a lot. And if you see on the left-hand side, you've got the GSM infrastructure, which is using proprietary signaling protocols like CAP, which is Camel Application Part, INAP, MAP, Mobile Application Part, and all those, those proprietary protocols that were there from the start of GSM. And they're replacing all that with more open protocols. For example, SIP. I'm sure most of you have heard about SIP. SIP is a protocol used in voice over IP. And they do the signaling with something called diameter. Diameter is very open. It's fully IP based, and it's going to replace SS7, which was obscure and difficult to access. A lot of the network elements are being replaced by open systems. Like, well, historically, a lot of them were running on Solaris, but now it's more and more running on Linux. The terminal, your phone and the network element, they're talking SIP, and they're using encapsulation protocols like GTP. And all this is fully IP-based, fully documented, and very easy for bad guys to get documentation on. So the attack surface has massively increased. And of course, now all your data communication are intercepted by governments. There's nothing wrong with that, but technology made it a lot easier. So now they can correlate all your, call, data communication, the websites you access, etc., etc. So this means, this means a lot of opportunities for hackers to abuse that technology. Everything IP means easy to understand and interconnect with. Signaling becomes open, a lot easier to abuse. SIP is a protocol that's easy to understand, and you can encapsulate it into GTP to have hostile payloads. Internal networks are increasingly interconnected to the outside, to other operators, to service providers, to a lot of things. And this made it a lot easier for people to have access to the infrastructure. So when you know that the ITU is recommending some threat models that have absolutely no relation to reality, you have a recipe for disaster. So where is this going? I mean, if you see the evolution of speed, you can see that it's getting a lot more practical to access and use those networks. And when you know that in 5G, you will be able to have super low latency, super high speed, and billions of devices connected, I can tell you one thing, that no one really knows what's going to happen with 5G. You cannot anticipate what will be the impact of that technology. People saying, oh yeah, 5G is just the next evolution, it's faster. No, it's a lot more than that. Everything will be interconnected super fast, and this is going to create a whole new generation of security problem. And this is going to be great for people working in the industry, because it's going to be a security disaster, in my opinion. Of course, people will tell you, yeah, my vendor is secure, my infrastructure is secure, etc., but that's impossible, really. It's too complex, growing too fast, and they want revenue before security. So that's it. Concluding with a few seconds late, what started as a closed garden that no one could access evolved into a worldwide digital network that people could interconnect with. It's used everywhere, all the time, by everybody. It's increasingly hacker-friendly. Security, as always, is the last thing. Well, not the last thing, but it's at least the second thing to deployment of services. And a large attack surface and expanding perimeter means operators are going to have a lot more problems than they used to. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you as well, Emmanuel.